In a dusty tent on the edge of a battlefield where the smell of smoke never quite left the air and the sound of distant artillery had become as familiar as breathing, a woman named Margaret Walsh sat developing photographs in a makeshift dark room, her hands stained with chemicals, her camera sitting beside her like an old friend who had seen too much. And as each image emerged from the developer tray, ghostly and then sharp, she noticed something she'd stopped seeing years ago, but that everyone else always mentioned. In every single photograph, somewhere in the frame, there was her horse, a grey mare named Witness, who had carried her through 12 wars across deserts and mountains and bombed out cities, and who appeared in the background of every shot like a shadow, like a guardian, like the only constant in a world that kept tearing itself apart. Margaret Walsh became a war photographer by accident, the way most important things in life happen. She'd been studying art in London in 1936 when the Spanish Civil War erupted. And a photographer friend asked if she wanted to come along as an assistant. And Margaret, who was 22 and hungry for purpose and tired of painting still lives in comfortable studios while the world burned, said yes. Without thinking, packed a single bag, bought a used Leica camera with money her grandmother had left her, and boarded a train to Barcelona, not knowing that she was boarding a train into a life that would define her, break her, and ultimately kill her. The horse came later, in Spain during the siege of Madrid, when Margaret was covering the Republican forces and got separated from her unit during a shelling. She'd been running through destroyed streets trying to find shelter when she saw a terrified horse, a young grey mare, standing in the middle of a square surrounded by rubble. The animal's owner presumably dead or fled, and Margaret, despite the danger, despite the common sense that said keep running, stopped, approached the trembling horse, spoke softly to her, and somehow impossibly managed to calm her enough to lead her to safety. Margaret named her Witness because that's what they were both doing, bearing witness to things that shouldn't happen but did. And from that day forward, they were inseparable. Margaret learned to write out of necessity. Witness learned to tolerate the sound of gunfire and explosions. And together they developed a system. Margaret would ride to the front lines. Witness would wait nearby, usually visible in the background, when Margaret set up her shots. And when it was time to leave, time to run, Witness would carry her out of danger faster than any vehicle could navigate the destroyed roads. The photographs Margaret took in Spain made her famous, or as famous as a war photographer could be in the 1930s. Newspapers across Europe and America published her work. Editors praised her eye for composition and her fearlessness in getting close to the action. But what readers noticed most, what they wrote letters about, was the horse, the grey mare visible in so many shots, sometimes just her head peeking around the corner, sometimes her full body standing calmly while chaos erupted around her, and people started calling Margaret the photographer with the shadow, because Witness followed her like a shadow that somehow made the horror more bearable, more witnessed, more real. When the Spanish Civil War ended in 1939, Margaret could have gone home, could have returned to London and gotten a safe job photographing weddings or portraits. But she tasted something in Spain, not excitement exactly, but purpose. The feeling that her work mattered, that her photographs could make people see what they were ignoring. And when World War II started later that year, Margaret and Witness were among the first journalists to volunteer for frontline coverage. They documented the war across Europe. Margaret photographing the devastation, while Witness carried her equipment and occasionally her wounded body when Margaret got too close to the fighting. They were in France during the Nazi invasion, in England during the Blitz, where Witness stayed remarkably calm while bombs fell around them. In North Africa, where the desert heat nearly killed them both. In Italy, where they climbed mountains to reach isolated units. And through it all, in hundreds upon hundreds of photographs, there was Witness, sometimes prominent, sometimes barely visible, but always there, always watching, always bearing witness alongside Margaret. The war changed Margaret, made her harder and softer simultaneously. Harder in the sense that she could look at terrible things without flinching. Softer in the sense that she cried more easily than she used to, usually at night in whatever makeshift shelter she'd found. And Witness, who slept nearby, would sometimes nuzzle Margaret's shoulder when the crying got too heavy, as if the horse understood that they were carrying something together that couldn't be put down. After World War II ended in 1945, Margaret was 31 years old, famous in photojournalism circles, decorated by 3 different governments for her courage under fire, and absolutely certain that she couldn't stop. She tried briefly returning to London and attempting to, settle into peacetime photography, but the work felt hollow, felt meaningless after years of documenting the most important events of the century. So when the Greek Civil War started, Margaret and Witness went. Then the conflicts in Palestine, in Korea, in Algeria, in Congo. 12 wars across 15 years. 12 conflicts where Margaret pointed her camera at humanity's worst impulses, while Witness stood steady in the background. The only constant in a world that seemed determined to destroy itself. By 1956, Margaret was 42 years old. Witness was 20, and they were both showing signs of age. Margaret's hands shook sometimes from old injuries and stress. Witness moved a bit slower. Her grey coat, now nearly white, but they kept working because neither of them knew how to stop. And when the Suez Crisis erupted in Egypt, when Britain and France invaded and the world seemed on the edge of another world war, Margaret and Witness were on the first transport ship heading to the conflict zone. The last morning started ordinary. Margaret woke before dawn, checked her equipment, loaded her camera with fresh film, gave Witness an apple she'd saved from rations, and rode toward the front lines where fighting had intensified. Overnight, the plan was to photograph a British artillery position that was engaged with Egyptian forces, document the soldiers, get the human story behind the strategic briefings that newspapers would publish, and Witness, as always, would wait in a safe position nearby, visible but out of direct danger. Margaret set up her shot, a composition that showed the artillery crew working while smoke from previous strikes drifted across the background. And she was adjusting her focus when she noticed Witness in the viewfinder. The horse had moved closer than usual, was standing almost directly behind the artillery position, and Margaret was about to wave her back when something in Witness's posture stopped her. The horse was looking directly at the camera, directly at Margaret, with an intensity that felt like a message, like a warning, like goodbye. Margaret lowered her camera, confused by the strange feeling washing over her, and she was about to walk over to Witness when the artillery commander shouted that they needed to reposition. Enemy fire was getting too accurate. They needed to move now, and Margaret, professional to the core, stayed to get one more shot, one more frame, the soldiers running to new positions, the chaos of retreat, and she raised her camera, framed the shot with Witness still visible in the background, and pressed the shutter just as the world exploded. The landmine had been buried in the path the soldiers were using to retreat, an old mine from an earlier conflict that no one had mapped, and when the first soldiers stepped on it, the explosion was massive, throwing bodies and equipment in all directions, and Margaret, who was standing 15 feet away, was hit by shrapnel and concussive force, her camera flying from her hands, her body slamming into the ground with force that crushed ribs and punctured organs. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Margaret couldn't breathe properly, couldn't move her left side, couldn't see clearly because blood was running into her eyes, and she tried to call for help, but her voice came out as a wheeze, and through the smoke and chaos she could see soldiers running, some toward her, some away, all of them screaming orders she couldn't understand. And Margaret knew with the clarity that sometimes comes in the worst moments that this was it. This was the death she'd avoided in 12 wars. And the thought that followed wasn't fear, but regret that she wouldn't be able to develop her last roll of film. Witness appeared through the smoke like a ghost, like an angel, like a miracle. The mare had somehow survived the blast, was moving toward Margaret despite the continued gunfire and the shouting soldiers trying to evacuate, and Margaret, lying on the ground, unable to move, watched Witness approach and thought this is how it ends. The horse I photographed in the background of 1,000 images is now the last thing I'll see. And there was something right about that, something complete. The soldiers who reached Margaret first tried to move her, but she screamed in pain. Her injuries were too severe for rough transport. They needed a medic, needed a stretcher, needed time they didn't have because enemy fire was increasing and the position wasn't defensible. And the lieutenant in charge made the terrible decision that Margaret knew was correct. They couldn't stay, couldn't risk more casualties for one person who was probably going to die anyway, and they withdrew, running for cover, leaving Margaret on the battlefield with Witness standing over her like a guardian that couldn't save her. Margaret felt consciousness fading, felt the edges of her vision darkening, and she used what little strength she had left to reach up, to touch Witness's nose one last time, and the horse lowered her head, pressed her muzzle against Margaret's hand, and Margaret whispered, "Thank you for seeing it all with me." And then she let go, let the darkness come, let the pain fade into something softer. What Margaret couldn't know because she died 3 minutes later, was that her camera, the Leica that had survived 12 wars, had fallen in a specific way, had landed with the lens pointing back toward where she lay. And in those final moments, as Margaret touched Witness's nose, the shutter mechanism, damaged by the blast, had fired one last time, one last exposure, capturing not what Margaret saw, but what witness saw, the photograph that would become the most famous image of the war, the image that would change how people thought about conflict photography forever. The British unit retreated, regrouped, and sent a recovery team back hours later when the area was secured. They found Margaret's body still in the same position, witness standing over her, refusing to leave, refusing to let the soldiers approach until the unit's commanding officer, who had known Margaret for years, spent 20 minutes talking softly to the horse, explaining that they needed to take Margaret home, that witness had done her job, that it was time to let go. They recovered Margaret's camera among the debris, the body was dented, the lens cracked, but the film inside was intact. And when they developed it back at base, when they pulled the negatives and saw the final image, grown men cried because the photograph showed Margaret lying on the ground, her hand reaching up, her face peaceful despite the blood, and witnesses' head lowered to meet her, and the composition accidental and perfect, captured something that Margaret had spent her career trying to show. The moment when witnessing becomes unbearable, but you stay anyway. And the photograph was published worldwide, won posthumous awards, sparked debates about war and photography, and the ethics of publishing images of death. But what most people focused on was Witness, the grey horse who had appeared in hundreds of Margaret's photographs, and who appeared in this final image not as background but as subject, not as shadow but as protagonist, the witness becoming witnessed. Witness was brought back to England, declared a veteran animal, given a place at a military horse sanctuary, and for the remaining 4 years of her life, she was visited by photography students, by veterans, by people who had seen Margaret's work and wanted to meet the horse who had been there for all of it. And Witness tolerated the attention with the same patient grace she'd shown on battlefields, standing still while people photographed her, touching her nose gently when children approached, existing as a living memorial to Margaret and to all the others who have witnessed and recorded humanity's endless capacity for violence. When Witness died in 1960 at age 24, the museum held a small ceremony, buried her ashes near a memorial to war animals, and commissioned a bronze statue showing Witness standing alert, head raised, as she appeared in so many of Margaret's photographs. And beneath the statue they placed a plaque with the final photograph, the one Witness had accidentally taken, the image of Margaret reaching up while Witness leaned down, and the inscription read, "Witness, 1936 to 1960, she saw 12 wars and never looked away." Margaret's archive of photographs was donated to the Imperial War Museum, thousands of images documenting 12 conflicts, and researchers going through them confirmed what fans had always noticed. In 93% of Margaret's photographs, somewhere in the frame there was Witness, sometimes obvious, sometimes barely visible, sometimes just an ear or a tail at the edge of the composition. And the museum created an exhibit called The Shadow Witness, showcasing Margaret's work with special attention to how Witness appeared in the images, and the exhibit became one of their most popular. Margaret's final photograph, in the one taken from Witness's perspective, became an icon of conflict photography, analyzed in journalism schools, reproduced in textbooks, used in peace campaigns, and debated by ethicists who questioned whether it was appropriate to publish such an intimate moment of death. But everyone who had known Margaret said she would have wanted it published because that's what she did. She pointed her camera at things people didn't want to see, and she made them look. And this final image, taken by accident, taken by a horse, completed her life's work by reversing the perspective, by showing that witnessing goes both ways. That while Margaret spent her career documenting others, someone was documenting her, someone was recording her courage and her compassion and her final moment of connection. This story teaches us that witness is not a passive act, but an active choice. That bearing witness to suffering is its own form of courage. That Margaret didn't have to go to 12 wars. Witness didn't have to stay on that battlefield. But they did, because they understood something fundamental. That the first step toward preventing horror is acknowledging it, documenting it, refusing to let it happen in the shadows. And while one witness with a camera couldn't stop the wars, couldn't save all the victims, she created a record that said this happened. These people existed, their suffering mattered, and I was here, and witness was here, and we saw it all.